Join us on another BackRoadsWest adventure as we travel through the remote expanse of the western Utah desert and find an ideal spot to watch a solar eclipse, then view one of Utah's largest dry lakes, and finally see the geologic oddity called Crystal Peak. The genesis of this trip was to find an ideal spot to view the October 14, 2023 annular solar eclipse that was projected to pass over south-central Utah. We wanted to be directly at its center, so the moon would be seen exactly in the center of the sun. Our goal was also to avoid the crowds predicted in the more popular areas, such as along the Interstate 15 travel corridor. We decided on an area about 20 miles north of the town of Milford. After the eclipse, since we were fairly close to Lake Sevier, we decided to check it out and then continue the 25 miles beyond that to Crystal Peak. So it was a full day of exploring. Our trip began by finding our way to Milford, which is 54 miles north of Cedar City or 100 miles north of St. George. From Milford, we drove 22 miles north on Highway 257 to a place on the map called Black Rock. Here, a dirt road labeled number 13 heads west into the great abyss of Utah's Great Basin Desert. At the beginning of Road 13, there's this old sign listing distances. The road is paved for a short distance, then turns to dirt. Our first stop was a well-chosen location where the eastern skyline would give us a great view of the eclipse. Our friends brought with them a telescope outfitted with a special filter to view the sun, upstaged by the eclipsing moon. Before the moon was centered on the sun, here's an image taken with our friend's telescope where the moon covers about half the sun. The image of the moon was enhanced in Photoshop to reveal the dim surface details that you see. When the moon was in the center, this is what it looked like through the telescope. Looking closely, we were able to see several solar flares, also known as prominences or corona mass ejections. The flares you see are very large, and each one is about the size of our Earth. Incidentally, our friend who owns the telescope also owns and operates Utah Desert Remote Observatories. The facility is located west of Cedar City, where the night skies are very dark and allow for very sharp images of our universe, like the ones you're seeing now. Customers can either rent the observatory's telescope or rent space at the facility to mount their own telescopes, which they can then control remotely and capture images similar to what you're seeing. This is a time-lapse of the facility and all the telescopes in action. Learn more about their business and see more dazzling pictures like these at www.utahdesertremote.com. After the eclipse was over, we continued our journey west on Road 13. Our first glimpse of Lake Sevier was about 8.5 miles from the pavement of Highway 257. Also in the distance, Crystal Peak stood out on the horizon like a beacon, even though it was still 28 road miles away. At about 12.5 miles from 257, this wide road goes off to the right, heading towards the southern shore of Lake Sevier. Although the lake has a French name and spelling, the locals pronounce it Sevier, not Sevier, as the French would pronounce it. The lake is primarily fed by the river of the same name, the Sevier River, which originates near Bryce Canyon in southern Utah, then heads north, roughly following scenic U.S. Highway 89, almost as far as the town of Nephi. From there, it makes a big U-turn and heads southwest to the town of Delta, where it empties into Lake Sevier. This large dry lake, or playa, is probably the second largest in Utah after gigantic Lake Bonneville, also known as the Great Salt Lake Desert. Technically, Lake Sevier is known as an endorheic basin, also known as a terminal basin, which means water flows into the lake and there is no other way for the water to escape other than evaporation. Terminal basins are common in the Great Basin Desert. Lake Bonneville, which includes the current Great Salt Lake, is the largest terminal basin in the Great Basin. Okay, back to Lake Sevier. We took that wide side road to the very end, only to find that it ends at this small building with equipment. We were surprised that it didn't reach the shoreline. From the road's end, here's what the south end of Lake Sevier looks like from our drone. Before reaching the current shoreline, you can see all the ancient shorelines that many people refer to as bathtub rings. The first feature we reach is this man-made inlet or marina. There seems to be evidence of prospecting on the lake. Often, valuable natural alkaline materials are deposited onto playas, such as borates and lithium. Further out, you can see this levee that protrudes out onto the playa. We'll later use this levee to drive out onto the playa without getting stuck. You can now see other levees that were built during some type of mining operation. As of 2019, a company has been given a permit to mine potassium from the playa. Perhaps these levees were part of the prospecting phase. As of our visit in October 2023, however, we didn't find any evidence of active mining or any other human activity. In fact, it didn't look like there's been any work activity around this part of Lake Sevier for several years. We'll now pan to the right so you can see the northern reaches of Lake Sevier. As we pan further to the east, the Cricket Mountains come into view, which are the mountains we crossed on our way in from Highway 257. Panning further to the right, we'll see where that road ended at the small building. To drive safely onto the playa, take this road that you'll see on the right about a half-mile before reaching the small building. This road will lead out onto this Levy Road and go out onto the playa for a few miles. As we drive along the levee, I'll pan the camera around so that you can see a 360-degree sweeping view. Don't even think about getting off this road and driving out onto the playa itself. It's damp, muddy, and slippery just below the surface. We tried to walk a short distance from the Levy Road out onto the playa, and just our body weight was enough to break the surface and slip and slide. A vehicle would get stuck instantly, and you're a long way from a tow truck. We drove onto the levee for about half a mile, then stopped and flew the drone to get a good view of the playa from this point. Near this mound, where I'm standing, which is situated close to the road, you might find mud cracks on the surface. Keep in mind that this Levy Road can get muddy and slippery too, and it's difficult to tell just how solid the ground is, so use your best judgment. Looking ahead on the Levy Road, the tall peak in the distance is Notch Peak. Its elevation is almost 10,000 feet and, believe it or not, is the second highest sheer cliff face in North America. Only El Capitan in Yosemite is higher. You're watching an aerial view of flying over the area where we stopped along the levee. You can see the end of the levee in the distance. At the end, another levee goes off to the right, a further distance. As we gain altitude, you can see that the levee goes out quite a ways. We didn't explore that far. Again, we'll swing to the right or east, then finally to the south, to where we parked, so you can see just how vast this place really is. In the distance, you can see the small building on the south shore we stopped at earlier. Like many flat landscapes in any desert, you will most likely see a mirage in the distance, tricking you into thinking that Lake Sevier contains water. What you're seeing now is a zoomed-in view of what seems to be water, but you can see where the playa's surface turns into what seems like water. It's a bit blurry. This is the telltale sign of a mirage. Also in these images, you can see different objects, such as tumbleweeds, that have been blown out into the playa. When we passed by the north edge of Lake Sevier several years ago while driving on Highway US 6, we saw this view with either a mirage, water, or both. There was definitely some water on the playa that year. Alright, let's move on. From the turnoff to the playa, we'll continue heading due west on Road 13. From here, Crystal Peak is 25 miles away. You'll continually see it en route. When we visited, the road was in excellent shape, smooth and with no washboard. Here you can see I'm actually traveling at 60 miles an hour. It's unusual for us to have the right road conditions to safely go this fast on a dirt road, and it only lasted for a short time, but it was fun. Our normal speed is around 30 miles per hour. Of course, road conditions are what determines a safe speed. As we head further west, you'll really start to feel how isolated this place of western Utah really is. Good parking spots to access Crystal Peak are located before the road makes its closest path to the peak itself. If you continue on the road, there isn't any place to park or turn around. However, just past Crystal Peak, you will get a good view of Basin and Range National Park, along with Wheeler Peak, the second highest point in Nevada. Crystal Peak is comprised of white-colored volcanic ash, created from the remnants of a huge pyroclastic flow. What you see today is a mere fraction of what used to exist. At the end of our tour, I'll provide a link to another video created by a geology professor giving his best explanation of how Crystal Peak was formed. Rather than me explain a summary, it's best to watch the full story from him. The solid white ash you see today on Crystal Peak is full of small holes and cavities. The peak looks like a big chunk of Swiss cheese. These holes most likely formed when the superheated ash quickly cooled and changed into a solid. The easiest way to access Crystal Peak and its crazy white terrain is to park on a small access road found on the east side of the mountain. After parking, follow various trails onto the volcanic surface and walk towards whatever strikes your fancy. If you're feeling really energetic, you can try climbing to the top of Crystal Peak. Otherwise, walk to the base of the peak to enjoy the unique terrain. We'll continue the drone flight you saw earlier so that you can see what it looks like around the north and east side of Crystal Peak. Hiking around this area is like walking through a maze. I found it difficult to pick a straight path. In the distance, we can see Wheeler Peak inside Great Basin National Park, which is 40 miles away. Turning left 180 degrees, we can see all the cavities and holes on the side of Crystal Peak. Hungry for some Swiss cheese and crackers yet? Now we're looking east towards Lake Sevier. Looking at the mountains close by, notice how brown and gray they look. Their normal color really makes Crystal Peak's white ash color stand out from every other mountain around. Here, you can make out all the diagonal scratches made in the ash. They're all at the same angle. We'll discuss these scratches in a moment. As I mentioned earlier, one thing we thought was interesting are all these scratches or cracks found in the hardened ash. Were these created when the pyroclastic flow occurred, or were they formed many years later? Are they cracks that formed when the ash deposit shifted over millions of years, or are they scratches from something that slid over the surface over time? We don't know the answer, but it's fun to ponder how they got there. One last thing, be sure to look close at the ash. You'll find a conglomerate of fine-grained sand with slightly bigger pebbles mixed in. After exploring Crystal Peak, we returned to civilization by retracing our route back to Milford and Cedar City. We hope you enjoyed our trip to Lake Sevier and Crystal Peak. Learn more about the geology of Crystal Peak by watching Sean Wilsey's video entitled, "Why is this mountain here? Crystal Peak, Utah." The video explains in more detail how a series of processes created what we see today at Crystal Peak. If you're thinking about taking this road trip, learn more about it by visiting our blog at BackRoadsWest.com and searching for Crystal Peak. We'll provide additional information, including an interactive map. Until our next journey, we bid you happy exploring.